The accident was life-changing. When you have a wife and child at home and you're not providing for them because you're physically injured, it's really depressing. I was on the verge of losing my career over my physical inability to go back to work.
It is devastating for somebody to lose a job that they have spent years preparing for and years doing, because so much of your identity is tied up in that role. Frank suffered a horrible fracture of his ankle that involved the joint. His surgeon was very open with him that his ankle was slowly but surely going to deteriorate over time, and that ultimately he was going to have a fusion. One of the most depressing parts about this type of injury is the one thing that you know for sure is that your ankle's never going to be better than it is that day. It's going to be worse tomorrow, it's going to be worse than that next month, and it's going to be worse than that next year. That's just the nature of that type of injury.
There's not much you can say about that other than I was scared. My sister-in-law found someone that she respected to get contact in Iowa, and he was the person that came up. A very short interaction with Tim and I over the telephone, and then it went to work.
Frank was hoping that because he was getting this great surgical care at Harvard Medical School, that he was going to be back as good as new. And it took weeks and months of rehabilitation before he realized that he was not going to have the same function that he had before. At that point, he was concerned about whether or not he was going to be able to keep his job at all. So he reached out to a lawyer that he knew on the East Coast. That lawyer looked at the case, realized that it was going to have to be filed in Iowa. And that's ultimately how Frank was sent to me.
There was no time that was wasted while I was there, that somebody wasn't gathering information about what had happened, how I remember it immediately, right? Not waiting 6 months, not waiting a year. It was immediate.
The initial investigation involved researching the circumstances of how he got hit by that forklift. We were able to request a lot of the investigation materials through Freedom of Information Act requests because it happened on state of Iowa premises. But then a lot of the in-depth research we did on the liability side involved researching the forklift itself and what the manual says about how to drive it safely. Because what we ultimately learned is that those rules were being broken left and right before Frank got hurt.
When I finally got to Iowa to meet them for the first time, I realized it's not just one person. There's a team of people working on the case. And I didn't know that. The impressive pool of talent, they're all in the same room. And I imagine that would be a frightening prospect for somebody sitting on the other side of the table.
One of the turning points in the case was when we got to find out about the person who was driving the forklift that hit Frank. We learned that he was part of the facility management team and had been on duty for over 6 hours at the time he hit Frank. There was never any intention for him to be on the forklift at that point in the evening, that he was just in such a hurry to get people out of his facility that he was just jumping in to kind of speed things up. The second thing that we learned was that it was actually his job to certify employees at this facility on the safe driving of forklifts. So he was not in a position where he could claim that he didn't know what the handbook said, that he didn't know what the procedures were, because it was his job to teach people. But once we had that sort of documentary evidence, we knew that when it came time for his deposition that we were going to win the liability case based upon our questioning of him.
I was a little uneasy, scared, but I finally realized that this is how it works. I have to let things take their time. And he was reassuring every time we spoke. They were very fact-driven. It's a daunting prospect trying to sue a state as a regular working person. When you have somebody on your side that's willing to do it and do it without being an ambulance chaser, being an ethical, skilled litigator. I can't stress how easy it was to let them do what they do.
Suing the state of Iowa involves jumping through a lot of hoops. There is a very specific procedure that the state requires you to go through in order to even have the right to sue them. And of course, like any procedure, there are all kinds of rakes that you can step on and mistakes that you can make that courts will use to deny your rights. First, you have to get through that paperwork process. Then you get through that paperwork process. Well, you're in the courtroom, you're suing the state of Iowa. And the people who are on your jury are taxpayers of the state of Iowa. And in Frank's case, we were dealing with an injured person who was not from Iowa. And so we had real concerns that the jury may hold it against Frank that this out-of-state person is trying to get their tax dollars. And so that led to a very long conversation during jury selection with the jurors about what was right and appropriate in that kind of a situation. And thankfully, we were able to find a box full of jurors who realized that Frank should not be penalized because it was a state of Iowa employee who hurt him.
They aggressively and actively chased down my insurance providers. They aggressively chased down the insurance adjusters and even workman's comp. When checks stopped coming for whatever reason, there was always somebody in the office who needed to know immediately. And I was never made to feel like a pest. It was always important to whoever was on the other end of the line that what I said was dealt with.
When somebody is injured on the job, oftentimes they have a workers' compensation case. And that means that they can get medical bills paid, they can get some compensation for the time they're off work, maybe some disability benefits. It's always a much smaller amount than your personal injury claim would be worth. But what makes it tricky is if you ever get money from the person who caused your injury, then everything you received in work comp is just a loan that has to be repaid to work comp. And so it is impossible. If you are injured on the job and the person to blame is a third party, you have these two claims. And one claim you're trying to get as much money as possible, and the other claim you're trying to pay back as little as possible. And you're dealing with two insurance companies who are both working against you. And so in that situation, I tell people, you almost always need an attorney because you're going to need an attorney to maximize what you can get in your personal injury case. And you're going to need an attorney who can negotiate to make sure you're only paying back what you absolutely have to for work comp.
You can't do any better. Once you see him in court, it's a different story. There's no TV, there's no waving of the hands. It's a very calm, procedural event that happens. Everything has to be down to order. His command of the law in the face of the state's best attorneys, they were no match. They were simply no match.
In Iowa, we have sealed verdicts, which means that the jury gives the verdict to the judge and then the judge calls the party. They deliberated for over a day. So after the trial was done, we drove Frank to the airport and he was flying back home. And when we ultimately got the call from the judge, we learned that the jury had given us every penny that we had asked for at trial. That was a fun call to make to Frank. And I still remember Frank's response. There was a pause. He couldn't believe it. And then his voice got husky and he said, "Thank you so much for what you've done for my family."
My life now is considerably different. I'm back to work, not in the capacity I was, but I still love my job. It's okay that I'm not the crew chief anymore. Those things have to change, and it could have changed for other reasons. But I don't look at any one part of my experience with Tim and his team with anything other than admiration.
We were able to negotiate a situation where workers' comp reduced their lien that accounted for the attorney's fees that Frank had to pay on the personal injury case, that they had to pay their share of our trial expenses, and then they reduced further what they had to pay in exchange for Frank agreeing to dismiss his work comp case, which is a win-win because in Iowa, workers' compensation companies get to choose who your doctors are, and that can be a hassle in its own right. And so we were able to settle the work comp case and use that extra money savings so that he'll never have to go get approval from an insurance company to get the care he needs. That money gives Frank peace of mind because rather than worrying every day, is my ankle gonna hold up? When I need that ankle surgery, am I going to have health insurance that's going to cover it? He now knows that he's got that money. It's in a safe investment so that paying those medical bills or missing out on those paychecks is not going to impact his family's quality of life at all.
It's really undefinable until you see in action how good they actually are at what they do. If you need representation in the state of Iowa, like I did, you can't do any better. It's really that simple.
It was a great victory, but honestly, getting to know Frank at that level is probably the best part about it because Frank still travels on the road with the artists that he tours with. Whenever they come into town, my wife and I will go see Frank and he'll take us backstage. It's been a lot of fun to not just be Frank's lawyer, but to become his friend.